Hello and welcome to our third CAHRS webcast for 2022. I'm Brad Bell, the William J. Conaty Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School. I also serve as the Academic Director of the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webcast today on capability building, trends, challenges, and opportunities. At the end of last year, CAHRS conducted its annual survey of HR leaders to identify the issues that are top of mind for them heading into 2022. The survey revealed that several of the issues topping the list had to do with capability building. In particular, leaders highlighted a heightened focus around topics such as leadership development, succession planning, and reskilling. On the surface, these themes are certainly not surprising given all the disruption and change that we've experienced over the past few years. For instance, as companies shift to new work models, including hybrid and remote, it's important that our leadership development programs adapt so that leaders are prepared to manage in this new environment. However, these themes are also being driven by recent challenges that companies have been facing in the arena of attracting and retaining top talent. As one HR leader recently conveyed to me, if you're not able to hire new employees, you better be very good at reskilling the ones that you currently have. To better understand these themes, CAHRS recently held a working group focused on leadership development and succession planning. In addition, we conducted a survey of our CAHRS partners to better understand the work they're doing around reskilling and upskilling in their organizations. Over the next 30 minutes, my goal is to share with you a few of the key trends that emerge through these various streams of work, and also highlight some of the challenges and opportunities associated with this concept of capability building. During the webcast, I'd like to encourage you to please share your own comments and questions as we go along. You can use either the chat function or the Q&A function here in Zoom. I'll be monitoring both throughout the webcast. And I hope to leave some time at the end of today's session to answer some of the questions that you submit. All right, let's dive in. The work that CAHRS has conducted over the past few months has highlighted three overarching capability building trends that I plan to discuss with you today. First, in years past, companies often focus their leadership development efforts on a relatively narrow slice of their employee population. For example, they would focus programs maybe on senior executives or targeted populations such as first-time managers. Today, however, what we're seeing is that companies are really trying to broaden the reach of these programs. They're targeting much broader and more diverse audiences in an effort to build their leadership pipelines. This creates, as we'll discuss, both some exciting opportunities, but also some new challenges. Second, given the expanding focus of companies' development efforts, it becomes even more critical to identify key talent and to do so across different geographies as well as career stages. However, recent changes such as the shift to hybrid work have presented new challenges that companies are experiencing in terms of identifying and assessing talent. Today, we'll discuss some of the barriers that companies need to overcome to ensure that their talent identification processes remain robust and also unbiased. And finally, while it's widely agreed that reskilling is more important than ever, various surveys, including the one that we did here through CAHRS, have revealed that many companies still doubt whether their kind of average or typical employee is really ready to adapt and assume new roles within the organization. We will examine today some of the steps that companies are taking to try to bolster their reskilling and upskilling efforts. So let's dive into the first trend, which really has to do with the fact that companies are targeting their leadership development efforts at a much broader and more diverse group of employees than ever before. There's several factors that are really driving this. First, during the pandemic, leadership development really largely went online. And as a result, that has expanded access to these programs. Traditional barriers to participation, whether it be geography or perhaps cost, have been either eliminated or significantly reduced as leadership development has moved online into the virtual environment. Second, ongoing labor shortages have created an acute need to both diversify and also deepen the leadership bench. Companies need to develop not only current, but also emerging leaders, and they need to break down barriers to demographics, location, and other factors that have traditionally limited broad participation in these programs. A third and somewhat related driver is the need for companies to attract and retain critical and diverse talent. Strong and inclusive leadership programs can help companies to pull in or attract key talent in a very tight labor market, and it can also help them to ward off other companies that might be trying to poach their best people. Although this shift to kind of broader and more inclusive leadership development certainly is exciting, it presents both a number of opportunities, but also some challenges. One clear opportunity is for companies to support these efforts by doubling down on programs targeted at underrepresented groups. In the working group that we conducted about a month ago, we certainly heard many different examples of this. For example, companies shared how they were adding to their portfolio of programs focused on women leaders in an effort to really accelerate the advancement of women in their companies into leadership positions. Companies also share with us that they allow different regions to tailor programs toward different populations depending on their specific context and needs. Depending on the region, these programs may focus on people of color, veterans, and/or individuals with disabilities, among other groups. Certainly, these types of efforts that are designed to focus on specifically underrepresented groups present a great promise in terms of diversifying companies' leadership development efforts. As companies broaden their leadership development programs, they're also likely to encounter a few important challenges. The first challenge is that it's really important to rethink the capabilities that leaders need today and what those capabilities will look like depending on the leader's level in the organization, as well as their specific function, and other contextual factors such as their geography or location. In the past, when leadership development was perhaps targeted at a more homogeneous group, it may have been possible to kind of adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. However, as these programs target a more diverse and broad audience, it will really be important to segment those learners and to identify the key capabilities and qualities that they need to be developed in order to be successful in their roles. Similarly, it'll be critical to identify the best way to deliver these capabilities. I think certainly with everything moving online over the last few years, we've become comfortable, or at least more comfortable, with kind of learning through this kind of virtual medium. That being said, I think there's a recognition that there will be times and places where in-person learning is necessary. So it will be critical for companies to really evaluate when in-person is needed and when virtual learning is probably good enough, and to segment programs based on those different delivery modes. An interesting trend that we heard at the working group was also the implications of the rise in internal mobility that companies are seeing. Companies are sharing with us that employees are moving much more rapidly, much more quickly, and at much kind of higher levels into new and different roles within their organizations. Sometimes that has been driven by the company, kind of repositioning employees during the pandemic as certain businesses maybe thrived and others experienced challenges. But also in the current labor market, we're seeing more employees kind of take control over their careers and ask to be moved into different positions based on their preferences and career development goals. On the one hand, this increase in internal mobility can help to support companies' development agendas by exposing employees to a diverse range of experiences and opportunities that can help them build key capabilities. However, it also presents a challenge in the sense that companies today need to be preparing employees not only for that next role, but they really need to be thinking probably about those next 2 to 3 roles, given that those roles are going to come much more quickly and sooner in employees' careers. Thus, the kind of planning process needs to be a little bit kind of forward-looking in terms of the number of roles that we're preparing employees to handle as we put them through these development programs. Moving on to our second trend, given the expanding focus of companies' leadership development programs, really kind of highlights the importance of talent identification and its criticality, ensuring that these programs are really kind of pulling in not only those current, but also emerging talents. And again, that those programs are really providing access to a very broad and diverse segment of our employee population. What we're also seeing, however, is that this process is becoming more challenging. In particular, it's given shifts that we've seen in different work models, it's becoming paramount to make sure that we don't let biases creep into the process that may potentially limit or restrict the access to these programs of certain groups. One of these challenges really comes from the growing use of remote and hybrid work models across companies. What we've heard from companies is that these models increase the distance, both kind of physical distance, but also psychological distance between leaders and their followers, that can make it more difficult for leaders to get to know the people that they manage and also accurately assess their potential and their contributions. Relatedly, a number of companies share with us concerns they have that the proximity that leaders have to different followers may influence or may introduce certain biases in talent evaluations. Either consciously or perhaps unconsciously, leaders may develop stronger or more favorable relationships with followers that they work with more closely in person. And they may distribute work assignments differently depending on employees' physical location. And indeed, research has shown that employees who spend the majority of their time working remotely are less likely to be promoted compared to their similarly performing office-based counterparts. What this suggests is that the kind of out of sight, out of mind phenomenon might really be a real concern as we think about remote work and its potential implications for career development. Finally, there's the potential that employees who prefer remote or hybrid work models may opt out of leadership roles that require them to be physically present. A number of years ago, in fact, I worked on a project for a company, and we were brought into that company, which had a very large remote workforce. And we were asked by the company to explore this issue because what the company was experiencing was they were offering employees kind of promotions, but those promotions would often require remote employees to return to more in-person types of work arrangements. Many employees were passing up those promotions because they wanted to maintain the flexibility offered by their hybrid or remote work arrangement. So there's a potential that companies may be planning for people to have certain roles in the future, but if those roles really require more physical presence, employees may opt out as an effort to maintain their flexibility. I think these challenges kind of boil down to several key issues that companies will need to wrestle with. One is certainly being more vigilant about ensuring that biases do not skew talent assessments. Perhaps, one good news on this front is that we've also heard during the pandemic, many companies doubled down on kind of digitizing employee skill and performance information. This information can be leveraged in talent assessments and discussions, and perhaps can serve as a way to ensure that these biases are counteracted if they do creep in. Also, companies will need to question, I believe, which leadership positions really require employees to be on site. There are likely to be some, if not many, leadership roles that can be performed effectively from a distance, particularly when the employees that a person may be leading are in fact themselves working in hybrid or remote arrangements. Being clear about which roles may be able to be performed virtually may create opportunities for individuals that otherwise would have passed them up if they were required to be on site full time. Our third and final trend really focuses on reskilling. The 2021 Deloitte Global Human Capital Trends Survey found that the top ranked item for navigating future disruptions was, quote unquote, the ability of people to adapt, reskill, and assume new roles. While 72% of executives selected this kind of reskilling as their kind of top priority for dealing with future disruption, only 17% of those same executives said that their workers are currently very ready to adapt and assume new roles. Our recent CAHRS survey revealed very similar findings. 80% of the companies that we surveyed said that compared to before the pandemic, that reskilling and upskilling is very much or somewhat more important to their HR and business strategies than they were before the pandemic. At the same time, none of the companies that we surveyed said that the average employee in their organization is very ready to take on new roles. Instead, most companies said that employees are somewhat ready, suggesting that we've made progress in helping to prepare them for these roles, but there's still some work to be done. Our survey revealed three main areas that companies are focusing on in their efforts to further enhance employee reskilling. The first is that they're adopting a hybrid approach to reskilling that really integrates both top-down as well as bottom-up inputs. That is, they're utilizing not only top-down processes such as workforce planning, but also bottom-up input from employees in terms of their interests and abilities and preferences to inform their reskilling efforts. This hybrid approach is really consistent with recent findings from BCG's Global Talent Report, showing that 68% of workers say that they're interested in retraining for new careers in order to stay competitive. Thus, interventions should really be designed to empower employees and to give them the responsibility for their own reskilling. A second area of focus is ensuring that reskilling efforts are aligned with other aspects of the HR system. In our survey, respondents indicated that it's particularly important to ensure that reskilling is supported by talent acquisition and retention strategies, as well as what's being done around succession planning, performance management, and total rewards. I think this kind of need for alignment is not particularly surprising, but it does reinforce that reskilling efforts can't sit alone on their own island, but really need to be part of a larger, more integrated HR strategy. Finally, a number of companies indicated that the biggest barrier to making progress in this area is really the lack of an end-to-end system for clearly understanding the skills needed to drive future business results and outcomes. As companies seek to develop these skill management systems, they often need to wrestle with a number of important decisions. For example, the participants that we spoke to were debating, do we rely on more skills inferencing and artificial intelligence systems, or do we go with lower tech solutions such as skill surveys? But certainly these kind of end-to-end skill management systems seem to be a kind of big barrier to entry as companies are looking to build out these reskilling efforts. All in all, there seems to be optimism that reskilling can be a powerful weapon for navigating future disruption if these hurdles can be overcome. All right, I want to take a moment and field any questions that you have. As I've been talking here, I've seen a few different kind of questions roll in, so I'll field those. But if you have questions or comments, I certainly welcome you to please submit those either through the Q&A function or the chat function here within Zoom. So a quick one that I'll highlight, will the recording be sent out afterwards? Yes, we'll be sharing a recording of this session. We'll be sharing a copy of the slides with everyone that registered for this session. So you'll be getting that sent to your email within a day or two, and certainly encourage you to share that with others who may be interested in today's session. So one of the questions that came in from Nancy is, what can you suggest as a means to address the manufacturing production line employees that are limited in time and technology gaps that keep them from continuing to gain new skills or strengthening others within their shifts? Yeah, I think that's a good question, Nancy. Certainly in the working group that we did, we saw we did have companies that had different types of workforces. Some were in kind of more manufacturing settings, others were in kind of service or financial services. And I think we saw that as you're highlighting, the kind of time and bandwidth that employees have is can be a key barrier. I think that barrier has been one that kind of all employees have experienced, not just manufacturing employees over the last few years, given the kind of pressures of the pandemic and the kind of burnout that we're experiencing among employees. So what we've seen a lot of companies trying to do is just make that learning much more kind of digestible and consumable, kind of, breaking it down into smaller chunks, trying to leverage the power of more kind of social and group learning, trying to embed that learning into the job or into employees' daily routines whenever possible, and when it's really needed to kind of do more extensive learning, to really kind of carve out time for employees to be able to engage that. For example, we heard of one company that took basically a full week to have employees go through different learning modules, and that was kind of their learning week. And it was dedicated time that company set aside for their employees to really engage in that intensive learning. So I think either we need to build it into the day-to-day kind of flow of employees' work, or we need to really make sure that we carve out that time for them to be able to engage in learning. I see a question from Nora in terms of how do you empower employees, how you empower them to reskill to support the needs of the business as well. Yeah, I think, Nora, that kind of goes to that kind of both top-down and bottom-up approach that I highlighted earlier. Certainly companies are trying to kind of empower employees to be able to pursue their interests and motivations, and to kind of guide reskilling into areas where they may have certain kind of intrinsic motivation. But at the same time, we need to make sure that those kind of reskilling efforts are really aligning with kind of the needs of the business. And I think that's where the kind of top-down, organizational mandates, the workforce planning piece really comes into play, to make sure that there's, some kind of guardrails there and some direction to make sure that those different priorities are lining up. So it's not entirely kind of, here's what we want you to do just from an organizational standpoint, but it's also not entirely employees can do, kind of pursue any interests that they may have. Sorry, my motion lights have gone off because I'm not moving around enough. A couple other questions here I'll try to field. Carmen asked a great question. Did the survey reveal any significant difference between manufacturing versus services or other businesses? Unfortunately, Carmen, we just didn't really have enough responses to be able to kind of tease that apart in terms of kind of industry or company sector. I think that's something we'd like to do as kind of a follow-up in a working group session, is to kind of dig in to see if companies are experiencing different challenges in terms of capability building, depending on their industry. I think the earlier question by Nancy highlights maybe some of those challenges will differ based on employees' roles and their kind of access to technology and other resources. But that's something that we hope to dig into more here within CAHRS. BJ asked about what are some of the challenges in the digitization of assessing and tracking skills. Yeah, BJ, I think as I mentioned, certainly many companies kind of highlighted for us, those that maybe weren't as far along as some that have been doing this for a while, really kind of highlighted that as the big kind of stumbling block to just kind of getting started, having those systems and frameworks in place to make sure that we really understand employees' kind of current capabilities, as well as kind of projecting or mapping those onto the future capabilities that we need as an organization to drive business results. And we certainly know that there's technologies out there that companies have been using. IBM is a great example of a company that has made tremendous strides in terms of using their Watson technology for things like skill inferencing and kind of passive assessment of employee skills. I think that technology is likely to become more and more available across kind of other companies as well. I think for those that might not yet have access to those types of systems, it's really a question of, can we use kind of lower tech skill surveys to kind of create these databases of employee skills. Surveys often ask employees to self-assess, and then there's often a kind of managerial assessment that provides a check against how employees rated themselves. And that can be a place to start these efforts. Michelle asks, what difference, if any, are you seeing in leadership development programs directed for existing leaders versus those targeted at future leaders? Great question, Michelle. I think one difference that we're certainly seeing is, I think for emerging or future leaders, it's less about building maybe role-specific capabilities as we might if we're say providing a development program for senior executives that are in specific roles. It's more about kind of building those kind of leadership qualities. For example, we've heard from many companies that they're really focusing on trying to build kind of growth behaviors, growth mindset among future leaders as a way to kind of prompt them for continuous learning and growth in their careers, but also just building that capability to navigate kind of disruption and change that is certainly a everyday phenomenon. So I think it's less about we need to build capability for specific roles and more about building those kind of general capabilities that we think that our future leaders in our organizations are going to require. Amit asks, when we're thinking about capability building and reskilling, do we need to segment employees? For example, technologist profile and hybrid work may be different from front-end branch customer service or sales team. Yeah, I think certainly that's true, Amit, in terms of, I think that's kind of the point I was highlighting in the sense that in the past, I think we really kind of had a narrow focus for these programs so we could adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. But now that we're really thinking about leadership much more broadly across many different levels, we might even be thinking about in the context of providing leadership skills to individuals that are more individual contributor roles as they're working in kind of groups and teams. How do they bring certain leadership qualities to those roles? I think there it's much more important to segment and to really think about based on level, based on function, based on other characteristics. There might even be geographical considerations giving cross-cultural differences. How do we really segment those employees so we understand and can target the kind of key skills and capabilities that employees in those different segments really require, so we make sure we get the biggest ROI on those investments as possible. And then finally, another question from Michelle. Are we seeing larger amounts of soft skill capability building, empathy, communicating effectively with impact, inclusive behaviors? I think certainly, Michelle, as I said, I mean, part of that, I talked about the kind of growth mindset and growth behaviors. I think that kind of feeds into that. Certainly, as companies are building out these programs for preparing leaders to manage in these more hybrid and remote environments, we're seeing a lot of focus on those soft skill capabilities, showing empathy. How do we communicate and keep in touch with employees regularly? A lot of focus on how do we combat the kind of burnout and well-being issues that we're seeing very salient at the moment. So I think there's a big focus on many of those softer skills, particularly around preparing leaders to manage in this new environment that the future work is bringing forward. Thanks so much for joining us today.